2 houses in a row, same neighborhood, same afternoon. I knocked on the first door, introduced myself. Before I could finish my sentence, the homeowner said, "You should be ashamed of yourself. I could never vote for a Democrat as long as they're the party of censorship." I asked, "Where do you hear that?" He said, "A lot of people are saying it." Second door, almost the same exchange, word for word. When I got home, I put on my policy nerd hat. What I found in the 2 years before that conversation, over 60 laws limiting free expression had been passed across the country. Every single one from a Republican controlled legislature. One Democratic vice presidential candidate had mentioned a related internet law once in a minor speech, and that single mention had been turned into a national meme campaign. That's not misinformation, that's a machine. And at those 2 doors, I realized I simply couldn't compete with it.
Last episode, we talked about how the media's obligation to truth got legally stripped away. This episode is about what rushed in to fill the vacuum, an entirely new model of political communication that doesn't need journalists, doesn't need facts, and moves faster than any correction can follow. Chris, let's start with the mechanics of how this really works. Because the MAGA communication strategy is not random. There's a real architecture to it. You described two fundamentally different approaches to political communication, the old school model and the new model. What are they, and why does the difference matter so much?
Yeah, so when I write in the book about the old school model, think of old school as the way that campaign schools and workshops and organizations have been teaching candidates of both parties for decades. And the idea is simple. The whole point of having a political campaign is to win an election. In order to win an election, you have to win for most races 50% plus one vote for the population you're running to represent. And in any population, if you can imagine a bell curve of that population, there's going to be some group of that population that will never vote for you, no matter what you do, what you say, just because of your party affiliation. There is also some people in that population that will always vote for you, almost no matter what you do or what you say, just based on your party affiliation. And then there's everyone in the middle, and that group is, lean right, lean left, but, like, generally, there's a whole group of folks somewhere in the middle who could be persuaded in some way, shape, or form. And the whole idea of traditional old school establishment type politics is you spend all of your time, energy, and money as a candidate trying to message your story, your message, your compelling narrative that hopefully you have to that group. And it's effective in an individual race most of the time. The problem with that old school way, and I'll get to the new school MAGA way in here in just a second, but if you do that each and every race, then you're always going to have a group of people that feel like you're never talking to them, either because you've taken them for granted or because you've written them off. And you always have a group of people somewhere in the middle that you're constantly talking to that, by the way, are pretty tired of being talked at. They're tired of that same old political ads. They're tired of the same old messaging platforms. On the Democratic side, the people who've been doing this for a while have been using the same talking points for decades. People want to see a difference and they're getting tired of seeing the same message repeated back to them over and over and over again. And I think that's a big reason why this traditional way of messaging and divvying up a population to deliver your message and try to allocate your resources appropriately might still make sense for an individual race, but over the long haul, race after race, year after year, decade after decade, it actually does more harm than good. The
Well,
other way, yeah,
why do you think that they're reusing the same talking points ad nauseum?
fundamentally, what that comes down to is we haven't solved the actual problems yet. So the same
Oh,
talking points that both party uses, right, are affordability is what we're going to work on. Well, things are not more affordable today than they were 5 years ago. If you're on the left, you'll talk about having the best schools. You'll talk about standing up for workers' rights. You'll talk about uh, having people be able to have the freedom to make the choices of live want to live. These are things are still being debated years and years and years later. On the right hand side, they'll talk about probably family values, gun rights, public safety, law and order, that sort of stuff. It's the same talking points recycled, but it's because
Mhm.
the same underlying issues are still there. And so that's why they get recycled.
Okay, I think I interrupted. What was the other point?
Yeah. So the other model of messaging is what President Trump and the MAGA movement had done from day one of his political movement, coming down the escalator. And if you take the same population curve and instead of recognizing if there's two extremes and you're trying to target the middle, what he does is constantly message what I would call early adopters, the sort of people who want to be on the forefront of something different, something cool, some new in group. And then they turn around, they create their own platforms because they're influencers online, whatever platform you want to talk about, and they repackage that message for their audience. And that goes to a whole nother level of people in the population. And when you look at the law of cultural diffusion, which is a Simon Sinek thing he talks about a lot, he didn't invent it, but I think the way he talks about it makes sense.
Mhm.
Is that by the time you get to sort of 15 to 17% of the population, everyone else just kind of comes along for the ride. And what this looks like in political messaging is this: President Trump will say something. His hardcore MAGA influencers that we can all name off the top of our heads if we're following politics repeat it in some way, shape, or form for their audience. A whole other group of followers who aren't influencers but are a tier or two removed retweets, reposts, likes, subscribes, sends it around to their friend group. That group then sends it around to one more group. And by the time you get just one iteration to that, you already have sort of 15% of the population. And all the people who are sort of old school Republicans or just disenfranchised with the Democratic Party or just disenfranchised with politics all of a sudden say, oh, millions of people can't be wrong. So that must be true. And here's the thing: President Trump says the same thing all the time. And I heard it at those doors. It's the presumption that millions of people cannot be wrong. But what you don't see is that there's actually this cycle, and President Trump uses that exact moment to reinforce that cycle. So he'll say something, his hardcore followers repeat it, that gets shared. And by the way, AI bots and other things help make it go viral because these platforms are owned by billionaires and a whole bunch of stuff is going on them that we can get into in a future conversation. But by the time that you get to like the level of millions of actual people are repeating it, it takes on a life of its own, and it's how you can create an entirely new reality that isn't based on the old messaging sort of premises that have been getting recycled for decades, and that's why it feels new and exciting for folks. But it's a fundamentally different way, and this is if you go back and watch the election races for all of Trump's races, every time he does a debate, every time he does a primetime speech, the pundits, the commentators that are supposed to know about politics will always talk about, well, I can't believe he's talking to his base. You would think he would expand his audience. But the only thing President Trump has to do to reinforce the cycle is keep talking to his hardest core supporters. And they repeat it and it keeps going. And that's how you create this sort of cycle effect that Trump has going for him, which has been unfortunately extremely effective.
So what I'm hearing you describe is a self-sustaining echo chamber where the voices refer to each other for confirmation, but not necessarily to any real authoritative sources that can provide unbiased validation of those points. Am I describing that correctly?
You're describing that exactly spot on. And people revel in it. And it's hard to see until you see it. And then all of a sudden you see it all the time. And every time you hear someone say, I don't know why I believe that, but I know a lot of people are saying it, that's what they're hinting at, whether they know it or not.
So, given the advent of AI and the speed at which misinformation can move, how does this play into the distribution of propaganda across the country?
Such a good question. So it used to be that part of the barrier to entry of being a trusted news source was the resources to be able to produce news, the camera, the talent, the screenwriters, the bandwidth to be able to put it out there. Now that social media combined with AI has basically made that barrier 0 for everyone, what you have is a approach as a country where anyone could be a propagandist. It used to be like the country or the people in power were the propagandists and they were trying to push a persuasive message that may or may not have aligned with actual facts. Now that anyone can, you run into this problem. And the problem as I see it is, we're a country that has a First Amendment. We really believe in the freedom of speech. Propaganda has always had a place, whether you think it's a viable tool or not. It has always been with us with some way, shape, or form. The flip side of propaganda, I think, is censorship.
Mhm.
And it used to be that the people in power would put out their message, and if they really didn't want people pushing back, they would use their power to censor folks. This is how you got the law that we often refer to without realizing it when people say, "Hey, you can't say fire in a crowded theater." Like that's a paraphrase from a Supreme Court ruling that happened in the World War One timeframe where we did have censorship laws. And what the censorship law that court case was based on was these anti-war pamphlets being passed out in the language of Yiddish. And the one of the Supreme Court justices said, "Well, you can't say fire in a crowded theater and use that logic to say you can't distribute anti-war uh, pamphlets during a time of war because we had actual censorship laws." The point I'm going with that is modern day with AI tools and meme generators and all this other stuff that's out there. There's another form of censorship that's just as important, and that's overloading the system. And if you can put out a millions upon millions of posts per day, then even the person who is yelling from their rooftop about what the actual truth is will never be heard. And that's a
Mhm.
new level of censorship that we haven't had to deal with before. And it's a way to use these propaganda tools to silence the opposition without having to actually overtly censor them the way you would have had to the generation ago.
Interesting to mention that because I know with technology and hacking, you can overload a system just by hitting the servers too many times, and it doesn't allow the system to function like it's supposed to. So, if we were to take that, I guess, analogy and transfer it over here, basically we're saying if the misinformation keeps being spread at the speed of a machine, it's very easy for it to be a real cog in the works of what should actually be working, right?
That's exactly it. And you just take that same principle. If you're in cybersecurity, you can take down the higher systems by overloading them. The same thing is true with our brains. If you overload it, it tends to shut down and tends to stop taking in new information. Hence, I think why across the political spectrum, this is why it's so hard to figure out because people who are operating the system are just flooding the zone. To Steve Bannon and I think it was Stephen Miller both said like their intention is to flood the zone so that journalists and others can't keep up with it. And you know what? It's effective. And it's not just effective because journalistic institutions can't keep up with it. It's effective because people who genuinely care, whether they believe in that message or not, can't keep up with it rationally. And
So, but
yeah,
you're saying political figures are openly admitting to this.
absolutely. It's recorded on video. You can go watch the recording yourself. And by the way, for everyone listening, don't trust everything I say. Go watch this stuff. Go research it for yourself too. You can a couple Google searches, you'll find it. But they were absolutely intentional in this approach. And that's why I think most people don't understand.
So we have folks openly admitting that they're trying to take the system down and or rework the system in a way that serves their agenda, not necessarily the nation's best interest, but their personal agenda.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that if you talk to them directly, that they would say it's in the national best interest to follow their ideology, right? Like that's how
That's how
you
it
can
gets
like
twisted.
that's how it gets, in my opinion, twisted. They would have a different opinion. At the end of the day, they openly admit that flooding the zone is something they're actively trying to do. They'll come up with excuses. They'll say, to be fair to them, that the media is biased, has a liberal bias, and so they need to flood it to equal out the playing field. I personally don't buy that argument, but they will come up with the arguments even as they're publicly admitting what they're actually doing.
Well, let's talk about bias then, right? Because each person inherently carries biases based on their life experiences and the way they were brought up and where, their roots were and any number of things that can happen over the course of their lifetime, right? How
100% we all have bias.
but yet we need to have some level of neutrality to try to as in the system itself, to help counteract the inherent act of bias that people carry. So what happens if the system also becomes inherently biased and people are biased? What are we gonna see?
You're likely to see in that situation what we're seeing right now, which is, I think, a perpetuation of all of our worst assumptions about each other. And
Mm,
let me just unpack that a little bit. There's 2 really good books out there for anyone who's interested in how algorithms are impacting our society, and this was written before ChatGPT and the large language models became household names. Both books were. One book is called The Weapons of Math Destruction, and
oh,
the second book is Everybody Lies: What Big Data Tells Us About Who We Really Are. And both books are written from this perspective, and one, by the way, is very, like, we should be really careful about algorithms and hardly ever use them. The other book is like, they're amazing tools, we should be a little worried about how we use them. And so they come at it from a pro, one from a con side, which is, I think, probably the best way to read books, by the way, for policy sake. And what they both come to the conclusion of is when you have these systems, and AI tools are exactly this. An AI tool basically takes in a whole bunch of information that people have produced in some way, shape, or form and allows that to create a mental model where they're predicting the next thing out of what's already happened. And so if you look at our policy areas that people should care most about, things where the government has a lot of power over our lives, things like should we be free or incarcerated? Things like should we go to war or not? Things like how do we spend our money or how should policing happen? And what you need to realize is all the data we have to ingest into those are incredibly biased already. It's why we have civil rights protections. It's why we have like so many barriers in the criminal justice system. It makes it incredibly inefficient. But those barriers are meant to minimize bias. It never can get rid of it. And what do I mean by bias in the criminal justice system? I don't remember the exact stats, but I think most people understand that white people, as a percentage of our population, use drugs at a higher rate than minorities, yet minorities tend to get incarcerated at much higher rates for drug offenses than white people have ever. So, according to the criminal justice system, you would say minorities use drugs a lot more. The unbiased interpretation of that is actually they just get arrested more for it, which is a totally different interpretation. But the algorithms, the LLMs will point you to if they're being used by a judge to say, like, is this person likely a user or not? They will point to this decades upon decades upon decades, like data that are all built based on laws that were passed in a very openly racist time in our country. Another example is, and why we need to be careful about using big data is even a not so sensitive example is back in the days where we had different GPSs, like TomToms and stuff in our cars before we all had smartphones. In some countries, and some of those GPS providers were selling our data to law enforcement to be able to like give us tickets for speeding and never advertising that to people. But if you take that speeding data, and some insurance companies have done this, which is why I brought it up, where you take data about cars and like where they get hijacked into, like, is it really fair for you if you live in a or if you just drive through a slightly higher crime rate neighborhood for your insurance rate to be higher than mine if I don't? And it's these sorts of things that are all over the place when you really start digging into it. But the bias is sort of baked into the experience we've already had. And what particularly these LLMs and these algorithms that we've used online to keep people like on these platforms really help reinforce those biases in a way that most people, I think, emotionally get because they stay on the platforms. But like logically, I don't think we have enough time to think through, hey, and this is why on most social media platforms, if you click on something just a little like emotionally triggering, you're about to get a whole lot more emotionally triggering stuff. You can try it out, right? Like pause this video, go on your favorite social media platform, scroll until you see something that's like, that's on the edge of what I want to see more of. and tap it once and see what your feed looks like for the next 24 hours.
So when we get close to election time frame, that's why we're seeing all these ads come through, and not all of them are even human backed, right? A lot of them are just bots or other countries creating accounts, right?
That's right. No one really knows other than the platforms themselves, and they're usually not publishing this data, but how many bots, and you can look back at news stories right after the 2024 election, how much all the social media platforms lost traffic because of how many bots shut down the day after the election. That's very well documented.
There's no anything holding these platforms responsible for reporting the bots versus actual human accounts.
The short answer is no, there's a little bit of a caveat to that. The caveat is this: America has remained very unregulated when it comes to data. And that's underlying, or that data protections is the underlying protection you need to really control big tech companies and what they're allowed to do with people's information. The data protections that we as a country have are only in three buckets. And then there's a fourth one that I'll talk about in a second. The first bucket is we do protect data about children. That's why if you have a niece or nephew and you want to get their grades from their school, you generally can't get it unless you're their guardian. It's a whole bunch of good reasons why we protect data about children. But by the way, those data protections aren't online. They're just for actual institutions. The second bucket is we protect health data. So when you go to the doctor, your actual health file is supposed to be protected. The third bucket is financial data. So we go out of our way to protect financial information, which makes sense. If that gets corrupted, then society breaks down pretty quickly. The fourth bucket that no one talks about enough is there is this law from the early 1900s that basically says companies have to do what they say they're going to do. I forgot what the exact name of the law is, but it came out of the time where like Coca-Cola had cocaine in it to keep people addicted, and like ketchup was being sold to cure cancer, and all these crazy stories you can Google. We are long past that, but at the time, like one of the original consumer protection laws were saying if you're saying your product cures cancer, it has to actually cure cancer. And what that means for today is these term and condition sheets that we all sign, okay, I accept without reading. A company doesn't actually have to have one of those, but if they do and they have an entire army of lawyers to write them up, as long as what they're saying they're going to do or not do, they uphold that. So if it's an internet company or a social media platform, they say we will never use your data for anything without your knowledge, and they have to hold to that. If you actually click through the terms and conditions of most of these platforms, they can do pretty much whatever they want with your data, which is why we have I forgot what the current amount is. The last time I looked at it, it was the actual market for like data sales in our country is well over $700 billion a year. You can go
Oh,
out and buy your own data. You can buy other people's data. You can buy a whole bunch of stuff. And it's kind of creepy.
I don't think anybody, when they think of the economy, would think about data sales unless they're part of those transactions already.
Yeah, well, it gets talked about in ways that doesn't make it sound like data sales, right? It's a targeted advertisement. It's marketing dollars. It's all of that stuff. I mean,
Oh,
Google, Facebook, all these companies make a lot of money off of advertising.
huh. So in a country where we're facing economic strain on the lower half of the K-shaped economy, right? Are people, do you
Yeah,
think, more likely to sell their own data, or is there a market for it? Oh, so only the businesses get the benefit.
correct.
That's wild. They're
It's
taking
bonkers. And
all data
the thing
and
I
they're
would
selling their own profit. Okay.
100%, when you really want to step back and say, hey, why is that a thing? Then you can go back to some of our other episodes of how much money plays a role in politics. And guess which industry is one of the largest lobbying forces in our entire country? It's big tech. So, as much as probably when you and I were growing up, remember all these public relations campaigns about the dangers of smoking and how much big tobacco is pushing back and hired their own scientists. And there was this whole thing. And then there was the sugar industry and soft drinks and like same sort of thing. Well, big tech like has gone largely under the radar until very recently in the American public's perspective. And there are way more lobbyists for big tech than we have elected members of Congress.
Where it's starting. And I mean, even behind the lobbying, it's like the sponsorship of like if you follow the flow of funds. I remember reading online that I don't know if there's a direct connection, but there is a certain flow. It went from like Epstein to Peter Thiel, who then sponsored the vice president, who then ran ran for vice president. It was like I can't say it was A to B to C like that quickly over the years, but there was a clear connection. And that's frightening when you think about who can really be behind the scenes sort of tugging at the pep strings of it all.
And in addition to that, it gets even more scary when you realize that a lot of these tools that are being made and that we're all using are almost perfectly made to keep us mad at each other, to keep these divisive walls up, and to keep people from realizing actually those two people I door knocked on and had that gut reaction probably would really benefit from the sorts of things I wanted to do as a representative for them. Like they're working class people I wanted to go support. But yet they spent a lot of time online and can never get there. I think, there isn't just one mastermind behind all of this. There's a lot of different people with a lot of different incentive structures. And I want to be careful to not go, full conspiracy theory here. But the incentive structures are real. You can understand them. And really, that's all you need to understand to really, in my opinion, want serious change. Because without that, we're going to keep seeing people just become more and more angry with each other and stop the change from happening.
I've heard a term that I've sometimes wondered about how it plays in weaponized belonging.
Yeah.
What do you think? Do you think it applies in, or it's in current day society?
100% it does. And where it comes from in my mind is this. We as human beings want to belong to groups. This is like deeply rooted in us and if you want to be Christian about it, you just know that both the Old Testament and New Testament are written in like tribal times and like a lot of people trying to survive and need to belong to a group in order to survive, right? In modern times, like I think most of us understand that we're better when we're part of a cool group. That group could be your family, it could be your community, it could be your group that you have a lot of like shared interests with, but like generally we're more fulfilled as human beings. And we know this from data and studies through and through and through. Health results, economic results, a whole bunch of things are better when we're in groups that we feel like we belong to. And I think what really happens in over the last couple decades is this. We're told this American dream exists. We're told that we have everything we need to succeed, and then we're not succeeding. And boy, you want to belong to a group where you don't feel bad about yourself. You want to feel like you're the good guy or the good woman. And that sense of wanting to belong is so incredibly powerful. And then you get these tools to say, here's how you're the good person and everyone else is out to get you. It's a really easy trap to fall into. And it gives you just enough emotional reaction and like logic to say, I can see how that makes sense. And you can almost sense it when you see a lot of it. When you know it's hitting your gut emotional reaction fast, but when you sit back and have to think it through and connect the dots, you really have a hard time connecting those dots. Like that's it in action is someone weaponizing like the sense of belonging for you. And I'm not saying whatever you're thinking right now, like whatever the topic is, I don't know what everyone's thinking. There are some good things to have strong emotional reactions to. That's not inherently bad. Like that's just part of being a human being. But one of the things I learned was when you can logically think through what you want to believe and your emotional reaction all lines up to it, you can really feel much more powerful about it. But it's having the discipline to sit back and actually logically connecting the dots. And I think we've all been in these political conversations the last 10 years, let's say, where we just ask people to clarify what they believe and they get really angry or they just completely disengage. And that is a tall tell sign for me that they're a victim of this weaponized belonging because they want to belong to the group and they've been bombarded with so much propaganda of like what it means to be in that group that when you're confronted with something that means that you may not be in that group or that group might actually stand for something else, the logical thing to do is just shut down to protect yourself. And we're seeing it all the time. And that's why these movements that are out there to break down some of these belief systems are hard. It's a lot of hard work. There's no easy button to it.
What's so concerning is you can start to see the manipulation behind it. Like people are living in echo chambers where they're getting self-validation from other people who are doing the same thing. And then there's lobbyists helping to reinforce that, and there's social media that's pushing those messages. And people are now are feeling afraid and or angry. And then to your point, we all want to belong to a group that feels the same way that we do so that we feel safe again. It's all emotional. Where's the facts? Where's the data? Where's the thing that brings us down back to earth? Anyway, I mean,
Yeah.
it's a lot to wrap one's head around. But the long and short of it is that, like you're saying, the machine is keeping people angry at each other instead of at the conditions that are actually making their lives harder. And if we're going to even reach back to one of our other episodes, the long story short is people can be convinced to vote against their own interests, and it can perpetuate those conditions that make it harder for them to succeed in life, thus making them still angry over many, many years. It's bad.
It's bad, and that's really the function of it's the function and the outcome more than the design itself, right? I think the design itself and the incentive structures, like I referred to earlier, is really about companies making more money and having the freedom to make as much money as they can. But the destructive side effects of that on the country at large is something we haven't reckoned with yet.
So if I'm building a summary of the last several episodes, once again, the economic rules were rewritten for a small number of people. The political system was inflated from accountability through running maps and structural design. The information environment was turned into a conflict, maximizing entertainment machine, and then the resulting frustration was channeled into division, like belonging, keeping people from organizing around the actual source of their problems.
And each piece reinforces the others. And none of it required a single conspiracy meeting, just each actor following their own incentives. But here's the thing I keep coming back to from those 9,000 doors I knocked on. When you got past the memes and the talking points and just asked someone what they actually needed, they weren't that different from each other. Cost of living, good schools, a road that doesn't destroy your car by driving down it. The machine convinced them they're enemies. The conversations that we had said they're actually neighbors.
Next episode, we start talking about the rebuild, not a theory, but specific reforms, tested models, things that have really worked in the past. The question is whether we have the collective will to demand them, and that'll be next time. So thank you so much for being here. We hope to see you again soon.